The Killer Clown, the John Wayne Gacy story. In the quiet suburbs of Chicago, where families gathered for barbecues and children played in tree-lined streets, a monster lived among them for nearly 7 years. To his neighbors, John Wayne Gacy was the friendly contractor who plowed their driveways for free and threw elaborate parties. To local children, he was Pogo the Clown, bringing joy to hospitals and birthday celebrations. But beneath this carefully crafted facade was one of America's most prolific serial killers, a man who would murder at least 33 young men and boys, burying their bodies in the crawl space beneath his suburban home. This is the story of the killer clown whose crimes would forever change how America saw the monsters that can hide in plain sight. To understand the emergence of John Wayne Gacy as one of history's most notorious killers, we must first examine the America of the 1970s, a time when suburban communities represented safety and prosperity, when neighbors trusted one another, and when the idea that a respected member of the community could be a mass murderer seemed impossible to comprehend. John Wayne Gacy Jr. was born on March 17, 1942 in Chicago, Illinois, to John Stanley Gacy and Marion Elaine Robinson. From the beginning, his was a household marked by violence and emotional turmoil. His father, John Stanley Gacy, was a World War I veteran who struggled with alcoholism and expressed his frustrations through violence against his wife and children. John Stanley Gacy was a demanding and abusive father who frequently beat his children with a razor strap for perceived misbehavior. He particularly targeted young John Wayne, constantly berating him, calling him stupid, and comparing him unfavorably to his sisters. The abuse was not merely physical, but psychological as well. These early experiences of violence, humiliation, and emotional abandonment would later be identified by psychologists as contributing factors to Gacy's development into a killer. At age 11, Gacy suffered a significant head injury when he was struck by a swing at a playground. This trauma resulted in a blood clot on his brain that caused frequent blackouts over the next 5 years. The medical condition was eventually treated with medication, but the psychological impact of this period, combined with his ongoing abuse at home, further complicated his development during these crucial formative years. Despite his troubled childhood, Gacy managed to find some measure of success in his early adult life. After college, Gacy worked as a salesman and manager at a shoe company where he met Marlon Myers in 1964. Myers came from a family with business interests. Her father owned 3 Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurants in Waterloo, Iowa. Gacy's marriage to Myers represented his first real opportunity to escape his troubled past and build the respectable life he desperately craved. The newlyweds moved to Waterloo in 1964, where Gacy took over management of the KFC restaurants. The position paid well, $15,000 per year plus a share of profits, equivalent to over $150,000 in today's money. For the first time in his life, Gacy felt he had achieved something his father could respect. He later described this period as perfect, noting that he had finally earned his father's approval. However, Gacy's move to Iowa would also mark the beginning of his criminal behavior. In the basement of his Waterloo home, he created what he called a club, where his young male employees could drink alcohol and play pool. Gacy's predatory behavior in Waterloo escalated when he began systematically sexually abusing his teenage employees. His carefully constructed facade began to crumble in 1968 when 2 high school boys reported to authorities that Gacy had served them alcohol, forced them to watch pornographic films, and initiated sexual contact. One victim also alleged that Gacy had attempted to strangle him. Rather than accept responsibility for his actions, Gacy attempted to silence his accusers through intimidation. He hired another high school student to assault one of the victims, hoping to prevent him from testifying. On November 7, 1968, Gacy pleaded guilty to 1 count of sodomy, though he maintained his innocence regarding other charges. Psychological evaluations conducted at the psychiatric hospital of the University of Iowa revealed disturbing findings. Doctors concluded that Gacy had an antisocial personality disorder, was unlikely to benefit from treatment, and that his behavior pattern would likely bring him into repeated conflict with society. On December 3, 1968, Gacy was convicted and sentenced to 10 years imprisonment at the Anamosa State Penitentiary. That same day, his wife Marlon filed for divorce, requesting custody of their 2 children and effectively ending Gacy's first attempt at building a normal family life. The collapse of his marriage and the loss of his children represented a devastating blow to his self-image as a respectable family man. Remarkably, Gacy proved to be a model prisoner during his incarceration. He participated in various programs, helped establish a mini golf course for inmates, and demonstrated the charm and intelligence that had served him well in his business ventures. His good behavior earned him parole after serving only 18 months of his 10-year sentence, a decision that would prove catastrophic for his future victims. Upon his release from prison in June 1970, Gacy made a promise to a fellow JC who picked him up. He would never go back to jail. Within 24 hours, however, he had decided to rebuild his life in Iowa and instead relocated to Chicago, where he believed he could start fresh without the burden of his criminal past. In Chicago, Gacy initially worked as a short-order cook, but his ambitions extended far beyond the food service industry. With financial assistance from his mother, he purchased a ranch-style house at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue in unincorporated Norwood Park Township. This house, which would become the center of his criminal empire, represented Gacy's vision of middle-class respectability. On February 12, 1971, he was charged with sexually assaulting a teenage boy who claimed Gacy had lured him into his car at Chicago's Greyhound bus terminal. However, when the alleged victim failed to appear in court, the charges were dismissed, an early indication of how difficult it would be for authorities to hold Gacy accountable for his crimes. Undeterred by these legal troubles, Gacy set about rebuilding his public image with remarkable success. In August 1971, he became engaged to Carol Hoff, a childhood friend whom he had briefly dated in high school. In 1971, he founded PDM Contractors, a construction and remodeling business that quickly became successful in the Chicago area. PDM employed numerous high school students and young men, providing Gacy with a steady stream of potential victims while simultaneously enhancing his reputation as a job creator and community leader. His involvement in local Democratic politics further solidified his standing in the community. Gacy became a precinct captain in the Norwood Park Township Democratic Party organization, a position that brought him into contact with local officials and enhanced his credibility. Perhaps most importantly for his public image, Gacy developed the persona of Pogo the Clown. As a member of a local clown club, he performed at children's parties, charity events, and hospitals throughout the Chicago area. The colorful costume and painted smile of Pogo would later become an iconic symbol of how evil can hide behind a mask of innocence and community service. On January 3, 1972, John Wayne Gacy committed his first known murder. The victim was 16-year-old Timothy Jack McCoy, whom Gacy had encountered at Chicago's Greyhound bus terminal. McCoy, like many of Gacy's future victims, was a vulnerable young person far from home, making him an ideal target for a predator who understood how to exploit such vulnerabilities. Gacy lured McCoy to his home with promises of work or simply a place to stay. Once there, according to Gacy's later confession, he stabbed the teenager to death during what began as a sexual encounter. In his later statements to investigators, he described experiencing a rush of power and control during the killing that he found intoxicating. This psychological reward would drive him to repeat the act with increasing frequency over the next 6 years. Gacy's modus operandi typically involved presenting himself as either a police officer or a businessman offering employment opportunities. He would flash fake badges or promise high-paying construction jobs to attract victims. Once he had gained their trust, he would invite them to his home, where he would use various pretexts to incapacitate them. One of Gacy's most effective methods was what he called his handcuff trick. Presenting himself as a skilled amateur magician, he would demonstrate how to escape from handcuffs before challenging his victims to try the same feat. Once the victims were restrained, however, Gacy would reveal that the trick required having the key, which he would not provide. The torture and murder that followed typically involved sexual assault, prolonged suffering, and ultimately death by strangulation or asphyxiation. Most victims were buried in the crawl space beneath Gacy's home, which he had enlarged specifically to accommodate the growing number of bodies. When this space became too crowded, he began burying victims elsewhere on his property and eventually resorted to dumping bodies in the Des Plaines River. Among Gacy's known victims were several young men who had worked for PDM contractors. 18-year-old John Butkovich disappeared in 1975 while on his way to collect his final paycheck from Gacy. 17-year-old Gregory Godzik vanished in 1976, with Gacy telling concerned family members that the boy had simply run away. The case of Jeffrey Rignall illustrates how Gacy's reputation and social standing protected him from serious investigation. In March 1978, Rignall, a 26-year-old man, was lured into Gacy's car with an offer to smoke marijuana. He was then chloroformed, brutally raped and tortured, but managed to survive the encounter. Despite reporting the attack to police with visible injuries and chloroform burns on his face, authorities showed little interest in pursuing the case, dismissing it as typical of the dangers associated with the gay community. This pattern of investigative neglect was tragically common in cases involving Gacy's victims. The social attitudes of the 1970s toward runaways, troubled youth, and the LGBTQ+ community created an environment where disappearances were routinely minimized or ignored, allowing Gacy to continue killing with impunity. Throughout his killing spree, Gacy's Summerdale Avenue home served as both his base of operations and a charnel house where dozens of victims met their deaths. The house, outwardly indistinguishable from others in the quiet suburban neighborhood, concealed a horror that would shock the nation when finally discovered. Gacy employed two of his PDM workers, David Cram and Michael Rossi, to dig trenches in the crawl space beneath his home, ostensibly to address drainage problems. In reality, these trenches served as graves for his victims. The workers noted the increasingly foul odor emanating from the crawl space, but Gacy dismissed their concerns, claiming the smell was due to moisture problems or broken sewer pipes. Carol Hoff, Gacy's second wife, also noticed the terrible smell, but accepted her husband's explanations. The couple divorced in 1976, with Hoff later stating that she had suspected something was seriously wrong, but had been unable to identify exactly what. The divorce freed Gacy from the need to maintain even the pretense of a normal family life, and his killing accelerated significantly after 1976. The beginning of the end for John Wayne, Gacy came on December 11, 1978, when he encountered 15-year-old Robert Piest at the Nissan Pharmacy in Des Plaines. Piest was a popular high school student working part-time at the pharmacy, and unlike many of Gacy's previous victims, he came from a stable, middle-class family that would not quietly accept his disappearance. Gacy had come to the pharmacy to discuss a potential remodeling project with the owner. While there, he overheard Piest speaking with a co-worker and mentioned that his construction company often hired teenage boys at the attractive wage of $5 per hour, nearly double the minimum wage at the time. Piest was scheduled to finish his shift and go home to celebrate his mother's 46th birthday. His mother, Elizabeth Piest, was waiting in the parking lot when Robert told her he needed to speak with a contractor about a job and would be back in a few minutes. It was the last time she would see her son alive. When Piest failed to return, his family immediately contacted the Des Plaines police. Unlike the families of many previous victims, the Piests were taken seriously by law enforcement. Lieutenant Joseph Kozenchak, whose own son attended the same high school as Piest, insisted on a thorough investigation. The investigation quickly led to Gacy, who was identified as the contractor Piest had gone to meet. When contacted by police, Gacy initially denied having any conversation with Piest, claiming he had never spoken to the boy. This denial would prove to be a crucial mistake that would ultimately lead to his downfall. Armed with knowledge of Gacy's previous conviction for sexual assault in Iowa, Des Plaines police obtained a search warrant for his home on December 13, 1978. During this initial search, investigators discovered several pieces of evidence that linked Gacy to Robert Piest and other missing young men. In Gacy's kitchen trash can, officers found a photo processing receipt from the Nissan pharmacy. The receipt had been placed in Piest's coat pocket by a co-worker who had borrowed his parka during her shift. This physical evidence proved that Piest had been in Gacy's home, contradicting his claims of never having met the boy. The search also revealed a Maine West High School class ring that belonged to John Sick, a 19-year-old who had been missing for nearly 2 years. When Sheik's family had initially reported him missing, Gacy had actually served as a witness, telling police that Sheik had sold him his car to get money to leave town. Authorities had believed this story, demonstrating how Gacy's reputation had protected him from suspicion. In the attic of the home, officers discovered handcuffs and shackles that Gacy would later admit to using to restrain his victims. While these items were suspicious, they did not immediately reveal the full scope of the horrors hidden beneath the house. Following the search, police placed Gacy under 24-hour surveillance beginning December 14, 1978. Detective Mike Albrecht and his partner Dave Hackmeister were assigned to follow Gacy constantly, a decision that would prove crucial to preventing additional murders and ultimately securing his confession. While under surveillance, Gacy demonstrated the same charm and bravado that had served him throughout his criminal career. He invited the two officers into his home to warm themselves from the December cold, seemingly enjoying the cat-and-mouse game of having police constantly watching him. During one of these visits, Officer Bob Schultz used Gacy's bathroom and made a horrifying discovery. When the furnace kicked on, it brought with it a distinctive odor that Schultz immediately recognized. This observation, combined with the physical evidence already discovered, provided grounds for a second, more extensive search warrant. On December 21, 1978, investigators returned to Gacy's home with the authority to conduct a complete search of the property. The search revealed the true scope of Gacy's crimes. In the crawl space beneath the house, investigators discovered the first of what would eventually be identified as 26 bodies. The victims had been buried in lime in an attempt to control decomposition and odor, but the sheer number of bodies had overwhelmed these efforts. 3 additional bodies were found buried elsewhere on the grounds, bringing the total discovered on Gacy's property to 29. The investigation would later reveal that 4 more victims had been dumped in the Des Plaines River when the burial space beneath the house became too crowded. As the evidence mounted against him, Gacy's composure began to deteriorate. On the evening of December 20, 1978, Gacy led police on a nighttime drive that ended at the office of his attorney, Sam Amarante. With detectives Albrecht and Hockmeister waiting outside, Gacy poured out his confession to his horrified lawyer. "This boy is dead," he said, pointing to a newspaper article about Robert Piest's disappearance. "He's dead. He's in a river." He admitted to murdering at least 30 victims, most of whom he had buried in his crawl space, with 5 others disposed of in the Des Plaines River. Gacy provided investigators with a detailed diagram showing where bodies were buried on his property and gave the names of 6 of his victims. His confession included specific details about his methods, his motivations, and the locations where bodies could be found. On December 21, 1978, John Wayne Gacy was formally arrested and charged with Robert Piest's murder. The recovery of bodies from his property required careful archaeological techniques to preserve evidence and ensure proper identification of victims. Cook County investigators, assisted by anthropologists and dental experts, worked methodically to excavate and catalog the remains. The process was both physically and emotionally challenging for the investigators involved. The smell of decomposition was overwhelming, and the sheer number of victims created logistical challenges that tested the limits of the coroner's office and local law enforcement resources. Many of the victims were identified through dental records, personal effects found with the bodies, or missing person reports filed by concerned families. However, 8 victims initially remained unidentified, creating lasting grief for families who never learned what happened to their missing sons. The Cook County Sheriff's Office, under the leadership of Sheriff Tom Dart, has continued efforts to identify the remaining unknown victims using modern DNA technology and forensic genetic genealogy. Since 2011, they have successfully identified 3 additional victims. William George Bundy in 2011, James Byron Hawkinson in 2017, and Francis Wayne Alexander in 2021. John Wayne Gacy's trial began on February 6, 1980, and became one of the most closely watched legal proceedings in American history. The prosecution, led by William Kunkel, faced the challenge of presenting evidence of 33 murders while maintaining the jury's attention and avoiding overwhelming them with the scope of the crimes. Gacy's defense team, headed by Sam Amarante, pursued an insanity defense, arguing that no sane person could have committed such heinous crimes. They presented evidence of Gacy's troubled childhood, his head injury, and his history of mental health issues as mitigating factors. However, the prosecution successfully demonstrated that Gacy's crimes showed clear evidence of planning, premeditation, and an understanding of right and wrong. His ability to maintain his public persona while committing murders, his efforts to conceal evidence, and his sophisticated methods of victim selection all argued against a finding of insanity. Psychiatric testimony revealed that while Gacy suffered from various personality disorders, he was legally sane at the time of his crimes and fully understood the nature and consequences of his actions. The prosecution emphasized that Gacy's ability to function successfully in business and politics while simultaneously murdering victims demonstrated his capacity for calculated, rational thought. After 5 weeks of testimony from psychiatrists, police officers, neighbors, and family members of victims, the jury took less than 2 hours to convict Gacy of 33 counts of murder. On March 13, 1980, the same jury that had convicted Gacy took just 2 hours and 15 minutes to sentence him to death. The announcement of the death sentence was met with applause from family members of victims who had packed the courtroom. Judge Louis B. Garippo thanked the jury, noting that, whatever the cost of this trial, it was a small price for what justice demands. Gacy was transferred to death row at the Menard Correctional Center in Illinois, where he would spend the next 14 years exhausting his appeals through the court system. During this time, he became something of a celebrity, giving interviews to journalists and researchers interested in understanding the psychology of serial killers. While on death row, Gacy took up painting, creating works that often featured clowns and other figures from his past life as a performer. These paintings, despite their dark provenance, sold for thousands of dollars to collectors interested in serial killer memorabilia, generating controversy about the commercialization of his crimes. Gacy also established a premium-rate telephone line where callers could hear a recorded interview in which he answered commonly asked questions about his case. This venture was seen by many as a final attempt to control his narrative and profit from his notoriety, even while awaiting execution. Throughout his time on death row, Gacy's legal team pursued numerous appeals through both state and federal courts. They challenged various aspects of his conviction and sentencing, including the admissibility of evidence, the effectiveness of his trial counsel, and the constitutionality of the death penalty itself. The Supreme Court of Illinois rejected Gacy's initial appeal, and subsequent appeals to federal courts were similarly unsuccessful. As his legal options dwindled, Gacy's final appeals focused on claims of ineffective counsel and constitutional violations. However, courts consistently found that his trial had been conducted fairly and that his conviction and sentence were appropriate, given the overwhelming evidence of his guilt. On May 10, 1994, after exhausting all legal appeals, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection at the Stateville Correctional Center in Crest Hill, Illinois. According to witnesses, Gacy showed no remorse for his crimes in his final statements. Prison officials reported that he remained conversational and showed no signs of fear as his execution approached. The John Wayne Gacy case had profound implications for law enforcement practices and societal understanding of serial crime. The investigation revealed significant gaps in how missing person cases were handled, particularly those involving vulnerable populations such as runaways and marginalized youth. The case demonstrated the importance of taking all missing person reports seriously, regardless of the perceived social status of the missing individual. Many of Gacy's victims had been dismissed as runaways or troublemakers, allowing him to continue killing for years without serious investigation. Law enforcement agencies across the country implemented new protocols for investigating missing persons cases, improving communication between jurisdictions, and recognizing patterns that might indicate serial crime. The use of forensic archaeology and other scientific techniques pioneered during the Gacy investigation became standard practice in major criminal cases. The case also highlighted the need for better psychological screening and monitoring of individuals with histories of sexual violence. Gacy's early release from prison in Iowa and his ability to relocate to Illinois without proper supervision demonstrated weaknesses in the parole system that endangered public safety. More than 40 years after his crimes were discovered, the John Wayne Gacy case continues to generate new developments and investigations. The Cook County Sheriff's Office remains committed to identifying the 5 victims who remain unnamed, using advanced DNA technology and genetic genealogy to bring closure to families who have waited decades for answers. Recent advances in forensic science have enabled investigators to extract viable DNA evidence from remains that were previously considered too degraded for testing. This technology has already led to the identification of 3 previously unknown victims and offers hope that the remaining cases may eventually be solved. Criminologists and psychologists continue to study Gacy's case to better understand how individuals can maintain public personas while committing horrific crimes in private. The image of the killer clown has become an enduring symbol of how evil can hide behind masks of respectability and community service, challenging assumptions about what monsters look like. The story of John Wayne Gacy serves as a powerful reminder of the capacity for evil that can exist within seemingly ordinary communities. His ability to maintain a successful business, participate in local politics, and perform community service while simultaneously torturing and murdering dozens of victims challenges our most basic assumptions about human nature. For the families of Gacy's victims, the case represents both closure and ongoing pain. While justice was ultimately served through his conviction and execution, the trauma of losing loved ones in such violent circumstances continues to affect survivors decades later. The ongoing efforts to identify unknown victims demonstrate law enforcement's commitment to providing answers to grieving families, even decades after the crimes were committed. Each identification brings a measure of peace to families who have lived with uncertainty and hope for resolution. Today, the house at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue no longer exists. It was demolished shortly after the investigation concluded, and a new home was built on the site. The 33 young men and boys who died at the hands of John Wayne Gacy each had dreams, aspirations, and people who loved them. The case of the killer clown forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and the capacity for evil that exists within our midst. It reminds us that monsters are not always easily identifiable. They can be our neighbors, our employers, our community leaders. In the end, the story of John Wayne Gacy is not just about one man's descent into evil, but about our collective responsibility to recognize the warning signs, protect the vulnerable, and ensure that justice prevails even when monsters hide behind masks of respectability. If this exploration into one of America's darkest criminal cases has moved you, remember that behind every victim was a person with hopes, dreams, and people who loved them. Their stories remind us of our collective responsibility to create communities where predators cannot flourish in behind the painted smile of a party clown and the handshake of a local businessman. John Wayne Gacy hid a horror that claimed 33 innocent lives. His charm masked cruelty. His basement became a graveyard, and his victims, so many still unnamed, deserve more than just headlines. They deserve remembrance. If this story disturbed you, opened your eyes, or reminded you to look deeper, please like, share, and subscribe to Weird World Wonders. We tell these stories not to glorify monsters, but to give voice to the forgotten and demand better from the world that failed them. Until next time, stay aware, stay human, and remember, the most terrifying masks are the ones we learn to trust.